talk about Active Directory, most people don't think, oh, Active Directory is going to go down on me, maybe like a traditional Exchange server or another application. But Active Directory monitoring is critically important. I'm super stoked to be joined by my friend and colleague, Sander. Sander is a 14-time MVP, 8-time Veeam Vanguard. He's written 2 books on Active Directory, and more importantly, an awesome human. We've struck up a friendship over the past 2 years, and he's been collaborating with us on our products here at ENow. He spends his days dealing with identity. Sander, you want to say a little bit about what you do during the day?
Well, just as little as possible, right? That's what we do as identity admins. We just sit around, and I have to actually get out of a seat once in a while. But yeah, just a bit of Active Directory, a bit of Azure AD.
And things are changing
like that.
fast, right? Things are changing fast. So you spend your time going in, helping people configure, architect, and solve very complex problems. So Sander's going to be leading us through this discussion today. If you haven't met me before, I'm the CEO and founder of ENow Software. I am a former engineer, started my days cutting my teeth on MS Mail and Exchange and Active Directory. I then started a company, can't believe it's been 18 years. What we do is we make application performance monitoring. So we make software that makes it really easy for you to do your job as an IT professional. It runs in the background. It helps you have peace of mind. And it most importantly ensures that things stay up and running. We cover Exchange, Active Directory, Office 365, but I'm super passionate about helping people, and I'll be here to help Sander along the way. In terms of agendas, we're going to talk about why Active Directory is important, some of the changes that are going on. What is the difference between domain controller monitoring and Active Directory monitoring? That may sound confusing at first because you need domain controllers for AD, but there is a difference, and Sander will go through talking about the nuances and what you need to look for. We'll also talk a little bit about the differences between monitoring and reporting. We will have the chat open. We want to keep this very dynamic, and we want to keep it like a conversation. So please jump in at any point, ask a question, and please be ready because Sander is fired up this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are. We're going to have some fun today. Sander, I'm going to turn it over to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about the topic at hand?
Well, let's go back to something you said first, because you were an Exchange engineer, right?
I was.
Yeah, so you know the meme with the voodoo doll and 2 engineers talking. Well, an engineer and a therapist, an Active Directory engineer, and the therapist holding a voodoo doll and says, "Show me everywhere where Exchange touched your Active Directory." You know that one, right?
I do. I have not heard that, but I get the joke. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it's always Active Directory's fault.
It's always Active Directory fault, yeah. And back in the Exchange 5 and 5.5 days, of course, we had Windows NT4, where we would have only a loose integration. And then Exchange 2000 server came along with Windows 2000 server, and everything was all integrated and things like that and stored in Active Directory. And now we needed global catalogs and all those confusing terms that we never heard about in NT4, Sam. But it's been that way for over 2 decades now, and because Active Directory is already 23 years old, and it's only gotten more integrated. There's only gotten more solutions that store data in Active Directory, and so it's important to look at the reach of Active Directory and see what's going on. And we've got some perfect examples today that show you how you can use ENow's Active Directory monitoring reporting solution to actually see it happening in real time, get notified in real time, and actually get answers to your questions. Well, Active Directory questions, right? All the other stuff is in the chat for today. Straight off the bat with that solution. Now, of course, there's something that I really feel strongly about, and that is that you can only do domain controller monitoring if you understand Active Directory, and you can only do Active Directory monitoring if you understand domain controllers. There's some solutions that look at domain controllers like they're just another application server, and they're not. So we'll talk about that as well. We'll talk about monitoring and reporting. And of course, if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A, put them in the chat or wherever, and we'll try and answer them And if there's something that we can show, we'll show.
Perfect.
So let's.
Thank you for that intro, Sander.
Yeah. So Jay, I remember a couple of months ago that we discussed a situation that we had at one of your customers where the ENow Active Directory monitoring and reporting solution didn't, according to the customer, of course, didn't show its full potential.
Yeah, you want me to talk a little bit about that scenario?
Yeah, I want to talk about that scenario because it's really funny because what happened is that all the services, all the things, replication, everything on the domain controller worked, except for authentications.
It was weird because NetLogon was running, the server was up, but it wasn't authenticating, and so to be transparent, we didn't catch it. And upon further investigation, we had to rethink how and this is the really cool thing about my job. So I run the product side here at ENow, is I get an opportunity to spend a lot of time talking to enterprise admins, people that are dealing with the technology. And I think the world in which we're living in now is things are changing like they've never changed before, right? Because of Microsoft's innovating at a ridiculous pace. Remember the old days, you'd wait to Service Pack 2, you'd install it, you'd have those features for 3 years, and that was it. And now we're drinking from a fire hose of features. So things are dynamically changing in the environment. So at ENow, we take a lot of pride at listening to customers. And as much as we love to say we can catch every outage and catch everything, that would be lying. So what we do is we listen and we try to understand. So in this case, we went back and revamped how we do that particular scenario. And we've come up with a way where we can get a Kerberos ticket. And Sander, obviously, you were very helpful in getting us to this point, where we can get a Kerberos ticket from the domain controller to verify if the domain controller is functioning. So now what our software does is, actually the next release, which will be out in a few weeks, it goes out continuously. It does a million other tests. And I think the point here is that there's different things, just like the human body, there's different things that can go wrong. There's different things that can go wrong with the domain controller, with Active Directory, with DNS, name resolution, you name it. There's different things. And the idea is that you want to be in tune with what's happening. But in this particular situation, the domain controller was up. It wasn't authenticating. It was affecting some line of business applications. So the impact was very, very high. And of course, the administrators were very, very confused. Why is it not working, right? And I think, I think that's another key point is not only, Sander, have I been, in the messaging space, I also worked part of an IT department as a messaging manager. So I'm very accustomed to the pressure of when things are broken. It's very unlike any other job. Other jobs, if you mess up, maybe your boss knows. If you're an administrator and you mess up, there's a lot of people that are impacted. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of stress. So I think that's the value of monitoring, is being able to have some visibility. A, can you be proactive? B, when something breaks, can you quickly know, okay, the domain controller is not authenticating. Let me take that offline. Let me take some action. At least that's my perspective.
Yeah, because I think I remember reading a piece of research about 10 years ago, where this was before Microsoft 365 went big, right? That if the mail environment of an organization goes down for more than 3 days, there's a 90% chance that the messaging admin would be fired. And that's 10, 15 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Like the canaries in the mine, you would be the first to be slashed from the organization, I guess. Yep. Even though it could have been Active Directory's fault, because could you switch to the environment, Jay? Because I know we have an environment that we can show you with the solution actually. And if we look at that solution, then what you'll see is that the ENow Active Directory monitoring and reporting solution can catch a lot of things. Could you show some of the things that?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit just briefly about why we designed it. So when I was a messaging manager, I managed 18,000 users across the world, and there was a lot of different servers I was responsible for. And I always struggled with, how do I get my hands around the landscape? And the original name of the product was Mailscape. How do I get my hands around the landscape of my environment? I want to be proactive. I don't want to be, I remember one time I got called in the CIO's office, and this was here in LA, and this company was doing quite well. So I went up to the, 60th floor, and they had knocked out several floors, so you could look up and down like you were in a freaking suite, and you could see the Pacific Ocean. I'm like, wow, this is really cool. And then I walk into the CIO's office, and he proceeded to rip me a new one. Very uncomfortable, right, about why things were down, and the tools that I had used had failed me. So in building our dashboard, we wanted to come up with something that was really simple, like a traffic light system. We wanted to be able to have the system, when it lights up, help you figure out what is broken, what's causing the problem. And we wanted the system to take into account things that you may normally do, and we'll show you throughout the presentation. You may run some certain PowerShell scripts, certain commands to check the health, but do you have time all day to sit there at your desk and run those? No, you don't. And this really gets to the heart of domain controller monitoring versus generic, server monitoring. A lot of applications just say, is a service up or down? Can I ping the server? Well, obviously, AD, Exchange, Office 365, any application is much more complex. So what we do is we integrate a lot of synthetic transactions, just like we were talking about the logon scenario. Is that domain controller, can it really issue a Kerberos ticket? Is it really functioning? So we put a lot of the test under the covers, but what you see here is just a simple dashboard. A lot of our clients, we have a global customer base, put this up in their NOC so that when something breaks, you can quickly say, okay, it's a network issue, it's a name resolution issue, or hey, the servers run out of disk space. And then, of course, there's deeper things like replication and some other components like LDAP expensive queries. But that's the idea. Is that what you were did I answer that question correct, Sander?
Yeah, because if it were replication, right, you would see it. If the server was down, you would immediately see it. It would not just be a red box. It would be a red blinking box in the solution. And that is, and that's where it got strange for that organization, because they looked at the ENow dashboard. It was all green. It was all good to go. And yet they had some really some real issues sometimes. And that's the fun part about Active Directory, because if you have issues, that's easy to troubleshoot. But if you have issues just sometimes, or just for one user, or only in the first 10 minutes after you reboot a domain controller, that stuff is really tricky to troubleshoot.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point here. If Exchange goes down, or a core service like Teams goes down, obviously that's cloud-based, people scream, they yell. I mean, it's such huge impact. But I think Active Directory is so resilient that you can have problems and not even know. But when it bites, holy smokes, it bites, right? It could be a security issue, or if the entire time I've worked in this space, which is about 20, 30 years, I've heard a handful of times where there's been a major AD issue where it was catastrophic, right? Whereas, oh boy, we're in big time trouble. So I think it's the more insidious problems, and that really requires the need to stay on top of it, so that a small problem now doesn't grow into a huge problem later. At least that's my experience.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the fun part is that Azure Active Directory changes about 3 times per day on average. But Active Directory as part of Windows Server only changes once every 3 years. Luckily, because otherwise I'd be writing books all day, and that's no fun. But what you see is that even though there's only new versions or new functionality, well, not even every 3 years, but most of the times within a Windows Server version, a lot of the stuff remains the same. And yet what we're doing, Jay, with the ENow Active Directory monitoring and reporting is we're catching up on all the scenarios that we hadn't covered yet, but that we can now finally understand because we actually saw it go wrong somewhere, and we can help other organizations in the same situation with some proper notifications, for instance, like the one you showed on the slide.
I'm going to go back to the slides real briefly. So let's talk about some examples that you've seen, I've seen, and can help educate some of our audience.
Oh yeah. But this is, for many admins, this is a horror story, you know. And it happens. This happened at Mirsk. They were compromised, and 45,000 devices and 5,000 servers were encrypted within 45 minutes. It's insane. And the reason why it was so effective is because the attackers use the same tools that we as admins use to do things effectively. And there's, I must admit, there's one thing very effective in Active Directory, and that's group policy. So how would you quickly know when a group policy object was changed? We have a report on that within ENow, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have a report here that enumerates, make this a little bit bigger. You can see here all the group policies, and what you can do is, this environment doesn't have a tremendous amount of data, but you can lift this up to the top, and then you'd be able to sort to see when things were changed. How would that play out in the scenario you're talking about right now, the scenario that took place?
Well, I think these admins would be fired because they haven't touched group policy for 2 months. But yeah, we can quickly see that there's been no hostile activity in the last week or month, right? And we can actually see that really fast. And there's a lot of organizations that struggle with group policy changes, and especially with rollback of group policy changes. But just having that information at your fingertips when a group policy was last changed makes it easy to troubleshoot whether it was group policy that was used as an attack vector. Because when you restore the ENow management server, you have this information in its database, so you can help the auditors on getting that information out. And every little piece of information that you get back from that will give you clues on how you were initially compromised. And when you find out how you were initially compromised, you can actually say, you know what, this is the hole we need to plug. This is the vulnerability that we forgot to patch or whatever. And we can do that. Now, someone in the chat said, this looks just like AD audit. Yeah, but that's just auditing. An AD audit doesn't do monitoring, for instance. And this is what you get with a solution that does everything for Active Directory. And I think we wanted to discuss a third scenario where, when data in Active Directory is inconsistent. So this is a hard topic for many admins, but we'll talk about lingering objects. So if you have a domain controller that hasn't replicated in the last 30 days with its replication partners, assuming strict replication was enabled, obviously, which it is by default, then what you'll see is that garbage collection process does stuff, and then if you restore it, you will get objects back that you initially deleted. That could be an admin account that you previously deleted that is now back. And what we're seeing is that it's not always obvious when a domain controller is not replicating. I've been to customers where they say, yeah, we've got some strange problems, and I look at their environment and it's like, yeah, your third domain controller hasn't replicated in the last 40 days. I say, really? Yeah. So let's go back to the ticketing system. Oh yeah, no, we replaced the system board of that domain controller or the SCSI card or wherever, and we had to reboot it. It did some funky stuff, and it didn't really get back into shape. But yeah, we thought it was okay. And that's where I feel it's important to have proper monitoring, because with Active Directory, if you assume everything is just okay, and I have to admit, Jay, I've seen organizations throw some pretty bad things at Active Directory, and Active Directory was resilient enough to cope with that. But I've also seen it go down fast, really fast. So what if we have some problems with replication, Jay? How would the ENow Active Directory monitoring and reporting solution show that?
So under AD Core, what you can do is you can drill down into Active Directory replication. We have a diagnostics, and really what we're doing under the hood here is we're running rep admin. We're doing just different tools that an admin would use. The value here is that it's running consistently. So you can see, are there failures between domain controllers? And then over on the replication status, you can actually see the partners and the partitions that are replicating. And I think the value here is that some of our customers have 80 domain controllers worldwide. If something happens in one region, what happens if that domain controller is not replicating and you make a change, you fire someone, you remove them, but then they authenticate and the change isn't replicated, right? So I think that goes back to the comment about things could look like you're healthy, but then you go get a blood test and you find out things aren't good under the hood. And that's kind of like how I liken AD to things could appear healthy, but there's little things that could be under the hood that can become big problems over time. So people might not be screaming. So what this does is it just kind of takes the guesswork out of it, lets you go through, and it'll alert you, hey, this domain controller is not replicating correctly.
And you also do DFS replication status, right?
We do. So with DFS, we're actually doing a full synthetic transaction. We drop a file and make sure that the file goes all the way around, replicates, goes back and forth. So a lot of times when we show people our software, they're like, oh, that's really simple. But as you drill down into the different tests, it gets a little bit more in depth in terms of what we're doing for each of the tests. But the idea is you don't need to be sitting in front of your computer writing PowerShell scripts. This is out running against your entire topology to verify if things are working correctly.
Yep, because I've been there. I've been in the trenches of troubleshooting NTFRS replication with the BUR flags and things like that. I can't recommend it. You see these gray hairs? Well, that's where they come from. Because troubleshooting file replication for sysful and stuff like that, that is awful with built-in tools. And the faster you're on that case, the faster you can resolve it, the better it is. Now, a non-replicating domain controller doesn't have to be bad. If we look at the Maersk scenario that we talked earlier about, they tried to restore their domain controllers from backup, but their backup was non-functional, so they couldn't restore from backup. They actually had a domain controller in Ghana that was suffering from a power outage at a site over there, and they actually flew the disk of that domain controller to the Reading head office for IT for Maersk, and they actually rebuilt the entire the entire forest from that one disk. So, yeah, there's things that could work in your benefit, but you need to know about it, and that's the entire thing. If you know that it's lacking sometimes, or it's fragile, or whatever in terms of Active Directory, in terms of replication, or things like that, it'll help you make the right decisions. Because if replication is flaky, then perhaps we need to look at the domain controller configuration or the sizing or the network. If suddenly a domain controller stops replication, then yeah, you might suffer, or actually your Active Directory might suffer from a firewall change that suddenly blocks traffic. The faster you know, the faster you can get that change reverted. And with the dashboard, but also with the notifications, you can have that power in your hands as an AD admin to be on top of things.
Yeah, I think when you look at today for global organizations that have domain controllers all over the place, big networking teams, a change could happen that was not intended. So someone makes a networking change that stops the domain controller from replicating. How long would it take for you to find that out? So I think that's really the power of the dashboard, is that it's running those tests, it spots it for you, and then you can take proactive action and jump in on it and kind of solve it. And then the other point is that if Active Directory is the foundation of your network, the impact can be huge, right? If line of business applications can't authenticate because the domain controller is not working. So that's what we think about when we're designing the features.
And we actually got a question in chat, Jay, about can it spot misconfigurations and send out alerts with possible workarounds? It's interesting because you would not believe the many ways that admins actually configure their domain controller. So there's one customer that we talked about recently, Jay, that configured each domain controller with 7 IP addresses of DNS servers, right?
Yeah.
And we actually had to go back to the logic to see how we could best help that customer with noticing DNS server outages, because normally you would have a notification or an alert that says, "Oh, one of your DNS servers is out. It doesn't respond in a timely fashion, so something must be wrong." But if you have 7 DNS servers, you might actually want to have a notification only when there's 50% of your DNS servers not responding. So it's really hard to define those misconfigurations, I think.
Yeah, so in that customer's case, they had several, I think it was 6, like you said, 6 DNS servers. And what the ask was, hey, if at any time if 50% are not responding, alert us. So we went back and changed the logic so we could handle that scenario. In terms of the question that was asked, let me pull that up. I just lost it. Give me a second. Here we go. So the question was, how granular is the monitoring feature? Can it spot misconfigurations, send out possible workarounds? I would say that's a loaded question. In some cases, yes. So there's a whole reporting side of the software that can help you track FSMA roles, subnets, who has domain admins access, but it wouldn't know what a misconfiguration is. That is an area that we're looking into to be able to go deeper and create more recommendations. So I'd say the answer is kind of somewhere in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
I see that Adrian posted an article here.
Yeah, Arian is talking about the changes that are coming mostly in the April community of updates for Active Directory. And yeah, that's another issue. But I'll park it for now because I think we'll touch on that a bit further on in the slide deck.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, because what we're seeing is that, and Jay and I talked to a lot of organizations, and what they're saying is that Active Directory, when it's not available for a long period of time, it's game over for any organization. Maersk got away. I think they did some really great things afterwards, because if you don't have any IT systems, but you do have trucks full of goods that need to be delivered and need to be loaded on board of ships and stuff like that, people created workarounds based on WhatsApp, and the CEO actually approved to have those new processes that were much leaner than the old processes to replace the old processes, and therefore they now have a much better situation, a much better approach to all the changes that are coming to other organizations in the same vertical. But they were lucky because they could restore from a domain controller that was offline. A lot of organizations don't have that. And one of the things that I've learned during my days at disaster recovering Active Directory domain controllers and things like that, if you have a organization-wide ransomware incident, so everything's encrypted, you're probably not restoring in the first week after everything got encrypted, because you're not allowed to restore to your hardware. You can't restore virtual machines to the same virtualization platform because you don't know if the virtualization platform is tainted or not. You mostly don't have a second office where you have sufficient hardware lying around that you can wipe clean and then start over and then restore to that. So you have to wait for auditors and forensics experts and people like that to go ahead and look at your environment and find the root cause or the root vulnerability that they used to compromise the environment. And only after that can you restore. So you're looking at a week of downtime anyway. But it really gets nasty after 2 months.
Yeah, that's.
There's no recovering from that.
Have you personally been part of any of those situations where you were called in and had to deal with that?
I was lucky enough to be on the sidelines of that during normal working hours, but I have a couple of colleagues that are experts in this area, and it's typically people that sleep during the day and are just stressed out during weekends to get customers back online.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, like, the stress level must be for everybody involved. If it's a ransomware attack and all your files are locked and you can't do business, that's the epitome of disaster for sure.
Yeah, and I've learned the hard way, right? I used to go to TechEds in 2008, 2009, Barcelona, be there an entire week and only sleep 16 hours during the entire week. I can't do that anymore. And that line of work, that would not work for me. So yeah, luckily I have some colleagues doing that. So and one of the other things, yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just saying, did you want to complete the thought? I didn't want to cut you off.
No, just get me away from that dark place. That was a good call, Jay.
Yeah, I didn't want you to go too deep in that. You're gonna have some PTSD there. I know I have a lot of war stories back in my day too. So you had mentioned, I know this is a topic you're passionate about, because when I first met you, we started talking about this, and you brought up the difference between Active Directory monitoring and domain control monitoring.
Yeah.
What if I play the contrarian here and say, wait a minute, Active Directory is made up of DCs? What do you mean there's a difference?
Well, so if you look at the way other solutions look at domain controllers, then what they actually say is these are application servers. They ping the servers, or they look at the TCP port. Is it running? It's running. It's done. Then it'll probably function properly. Well, you and I both know that that's not the case, not necessarily. So you have to look into the domain controller stuff to see what's going on. And I already mentioned strict replication, for instance, and strict replication is something that is a registry setting. No, that's not a registry setting. That's not a registry setting. But there's settings in Active Directory in the registry of domain controllers that actually govern how a domain controller responds, how it operates, how it works. And if you don't notice those registry changes, you won't notice the changes in behavior, and you won't notice when something creeps up on you over time. And that's why, if you want to do Active Directory monitoring right, and if you want to be in a place where, as an Active Directory monitoring solution, you actually prevent outages, and you actually look at an environment and say, you know what, this is what we see in changes in registry, for instance, and things like having been restored from a backup, or having created a new invocation ID and therefore being a new replication partner for all the other domain controllers. That's something that is in Active Directory. It's something in the registry of your domain controllers. If you don't see that, you might miss a lot of things that are happening, that are going wrong, that might prevent replication going forward in your Active Directory environment. Well, the same thing goes for disk space, obviously, and I was hurt pretty badly a couple of decades ago when I thought, you know what, I have 40 megs of scripts in my sysvol, so let's just create 100 meg disk for the sysvol and be done with it. And I completely forgot that in Windows 2000 Server, there's a 512 meg journal store size that is just claimed on disk, so it wouldn't start. And then I think it was Windows Server 2008 when it upped to a gig of journal space. So there's all kinds of processes that work on a domain controller that already make sure that if there's disk space, for instance, on the disk where you would have your sysvol, that it won't hurt replication that much, unless you go beyond that journal space.
So let
me monitor that.
So let me put that back at you, just because I think I'm getting it now. So when you talk about just the difference between DC and application monitor, you're talking about generic tools that just look for, hey, can I ping the server? Is the service up? Yeah. So it's very generic. It's almost like, hey, is the patient alive? kind of looking at it from that perspective. And then from a DC AD perspective, so things like DC monitoring would be like expensive LDAP queries that are hitting a particular DC, whereas you view Active Directory monitoring as replication, name resolution, the FSMO roles, basically the infrastructure that AD is running. That's the delineation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And of course, there's a lot of things that are stored in Active Directory, and there's a lot of things that might prove useful in the long run that you can already monitor in near real time on domain controllers already. And that's one of the discussions that we're having on all sorts of things that could accumulate in the long run to an outage, that we might already give a big blinking red box on the monitoring side and say, you know what, something changed. Let's go and look at it. The same with event monitoring, right? We look at the event logs of domain controllers, and if there's something happening there, if there's an error, you would get a red blinking box, say, you know what, there's something in the event log that we think you should look at because it is a warning or an error in the Active Directory log, the specific log that Active Directory logs to. And then if we zoom out from those domain controllers and we look at the bigger picture, we look at Active Directory itself, then yeah, sure, yeah, we need to make sure that the services are running, that if we communicate to a certain port, that we actually get it back what we expect. So we don't ping a port, we don't do a test -net connection. No, we actually do a port query and look at that domain controller and say, you know what does it give back? Is it actually telling us it's a global catalog when it is a global catalog or configured as a global catalog? Because that bit me one weekend. I can still remember that. If you have a domain controller and you configure it as a global catalog, it will not instantly exchange traffic on those 3268 and 3269 ports that Exchange loves to talk about. No, you have to actually restart the domain controller before that actually happens. There's zero documentation on that. But after I rebooted the domain controller, Exchange suddenly could talk to my new domain controllers, which is like insane.
So that's why our Exchange product actually monitors that port for that reason, because that is common.
Yeah, I mean, I knew you'd love that story as an Exchange admin.
Don't make fun of us, Exchange admins. If someone put it in the chat, it's always DNS. It's never our fault.
Is it always DNS? Could you show me, because I also saw a time monitoring question. Could you show me what we monitor in terms of DNS?
Sure.
And time.
So from a DNS perspective,
because it's not always DNS, by the way. It's DNS or PKI or a typo.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's always more complex than what it sounds. So from a DNS perspective, I can show a couple of things here. Obviously, DNS is I guess I don't know if you want to say it's complex. I guess it's simple, but DNS is an area that people tend to tinker, and things tend to get broken a lot. At least that's been my experience. So we have different tests that are going out and verifying the records to make sure the records are correct. Are they accessible? So you have the different types of records that you need in order to have Active Directory functioning correctly. And again, this is designed to make sure that usually what happens, at least from my experience, is someone makes a change and then you find out about it later. And then it takes time to go figure out what was the change. So again, the magic here is to be able to give you that visibility.
And of course, we don't care about time, right?
You want to talk a little bit about time and the challenges that it causes? I'll leave this up here for you.
Yeah, so this is something that if we're talking about misconfigurations, I think especially with virtualizing domain controllers, this is the one mistake that a lot of organizations make in terms of time synchronization, and forgetting to configure an authoritative time source out on the internet or a GPS enabled device that gets time right in your network, and then not having the right W32 time settings on host and things like that. this particular monitoring rule adds that to Windows DNS. So Nicholas is asking, do you have the visibility like Infoblox or Cloudflare for DNS monitoring?
I don't know the answer to that question.
But if you want it built, then we probably could.
Yeah, we're flexible. I'm not. Are you familiar with those solutions?
I'm familiar with Infoblox. Yeah. Yeah, that's an entire new world of pain.
I think the answer is no, but that's something we can look into.
Yeah, we see Infoblox appliances at a lot of larger environments where domain controllers are not configured with DNS, but the Infoblox devices are, or there's a Cisco umbrella device, for instance, that sits between the domain controllers as a DNS proxy, if you will. And there's all sorts of interesting challenges with those setups. And I'm always glad when organizations just use Windows DNS because it integrates just nicely. So when you look at Active Directory monitoring and domain controller monitoring, what we're actually looking at with Active Directory monitoring is all the Active Directory protocols. It's all the things that are going on in our domain controllers. And if we are looking at domain controller monitoring, we're actually looking at those hosts themselves. We're actually looking at the hosts that make up the Active Directory goodness, that host that Active Directory stuff. And you need both. Now, luckily, Jay already showed you a lot of things about Active Directory monitoring. So it's about DNS servers, are they reachable, the port verification, so not a port ping, but a port verification. And it's funny because NTP uses UDP 123, and it's UDP is pretty hard to verify, but of course we know how to do that. The name resolution checks you showed us, the backup verification. This is something that is just in the database that we can just get out and see when was a specific partition, an Active Directory partition, last backed up. We can show. I think it's disabled in our POC environment, right?
Which test was that?
The backup verification. I saw it was darker green.
No, it's in here. Give me a second. Here you go. You never know what you're going to get with one of these environments. So you can shame us because this has not been backed up since January 16th.
And now it pops up as showing, you know what, it's no good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's under replication. Since you have LDAP on the screen, I just want to briefly show this. So you recommend testing the bind time. You can come in here. We've had some clients that have had applications hitting the domain controller that are just monopolizing essentially the DC. So this can show you the bind time status. Now this is a lab environment, so you're not going to see as much data, but you can come in here and kind of see the number of sessions that are happening. If there was an expensive LDAP query, it would show up in this list. There isn't one configured here. So you'd be able to identify the culprit, and then you can also see the LDAP searches by second. So again, just giving you a little bit more visibility. Yeah. And I think the key here is that what you're showing on this slide is there's a lot to cover. And if you have a lot of domain controllers globally, is all this stuff being managed, right? Is somebody making a change? Is something happening?
Yep, definitely. And then if we look at domain controller monitoring, then there's all those things that we need to do. There's the services that we want to check. There's the event log that we want to check, the CPU and the RAM and disk space that we want to check, but also in registry of a domain controller. So what are the NTDS parameters in HKey local machine in the current control set, or the parameters for LSA, or the parameters for the KDC, the key distribution center, the service that makes up a domain controller if you ask MIT. Now, there's also a couple of other things that you want to look at, like the clonable domain controllers group membership, because if a domain controller is a member of that group, then that domain controller can be cloned, and that might be a security risk. The other thing, and it's nicely written to the log, so you get a daily prompt about that, is the Active Directory database white space. I come across loads of organizations that ask me, you know what, we've got some we got some crud in our Active Directory, and we would like you to clean it up because there was pen tester XYZ, red team, you name it, or auditor, whoever, that said that we do not delete stale objects, for instance. And then as we work to get all the service accounts that are no longer needed removed, as we remove the computer accounts that have never been used to sign in and all those stuff, you actually have a database with a lot of white space in it. And of course, if you look at that, you can optimize that and actually do a compact of the database. The domain controller needs to go down for that. But you can compact the database and then help the performance of that domain controller increase further. Now, stale objects is something that we do with monitoring, I think, right? Well, no, I'm sorry, with reporting, Jay.
See if I have that queued up. I might not. Which report were you thinking of?
Well, I think it's slide 13, by the way, that says,
sorry.
That we go from monitoring to reporting. Yep.
Gotcha.
But if you go to the reporting side of ENow Active Directory monitoring reporting, then what you actually see is those stale objects and computer accounts that have never been logged on. We have reports on that.
Yeah, users that the last log on time by DC, recently deleted computers. Are those ones you were thinking of?
Yeah, there's one that I always find fun, is the computers that have never logged on. So one of the things that we're seeing, especially with the new, and thank you, Arjan, for that, with the new domain join settings, is that we're seeing more and more organizations stopping creating computer accounts and then forgetting that they did. Because if you create a computer account in Active Directory, what you're basically creating is an account that can log on to Active Directory. When you create a computer account in Active Directory, it will have a default password. It will be the NetBIOS hostname in all capitals and then a $sign at the end. That's the default password. If a computer account is never used to log on, so you don't actually domain join the host with the same NetBIOS name, an adversary will have an account that they can use to authenticate to your domain controllers and actually get stuff out of the domain. So that's why those reports are really handy. But you wouldn't. So, Jay, if I have someone who's responsible for that, right? They don't necessarily have to sign in to the ENow portal to get that information, right?
No, you can have the reports mailed to you on a scheduled basis. So the idea behind the software is the traffic light system can be used by the NOC, so they can just quickly alert you to when something's happening. You can customize it based on views. So for our global customers that have 80 servers, you may have a dashboard for the Hong Kong region. You may have people that are doing cleanup, like the help desk, if you want to know people's passwords that are expiring. The tool can be configured and the information can be disseminated. And that's really true. When you support AD, everyone plays a role, right? The help desk plays a role, the user plays a role, the admin plays a role, the DNS team, the networking team. It's the total of all those people that support the solution. The AD administrator is just on the hook to make sure that things are taking place and the servers are being maintained.
Yep, it's us again. We're responsible for everything.
Got to throw it back at you. So we're down to about 2 to 3 more minutes. What else did you want to share, Sander? I mean, obviously there's a lot of reports here that.
Oh yeah, I want to share my favorite report.
Sure, go for it.
It's the one where we show admins a breakdown between NTLM and Kerberos and LDAP.
This report?
Ah, that report. You got it preloaded already. Yeah, the domain control authentication activity. Yeah.
And how would you use this report?
So one of the things that that I typically look at is how NTLM and Kerberos are stacked against each other. And basically, if there's more NTLM than Kerberos, then I know that there's something funky going on in that environment.
Can you repeat that one more time? I'm sorry, say that again.
There might be something funky going on. Because there's only a couple of reasons why you would fall back to NTLM and not have Kerberos. Like this environment only has Kerberos, no NTLM. And that's because you're a good admin and you wouldn't connect to a server over the IP address, right?
So we're going to end this on a high note. Thank you for the compliment.
You don't connect to SQL Server named pipes. So you don't have failover clusters running Windows Server 2016 or below, stuff like that. Those are all things that still in Windows Server fall back to NTLM. And if you don't configure it, they'll fall back all the way to NTLM v1. And having the opportunity to filter on that NTLM v1 traffic and know what hosts are using that horribly outdated version of that authentication protocol will make sure that you can pinpoint that, eradicate that, and then set the settings to disable NTLM in your network altogether.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of keeping track of all this. Oops, hang on one second. Wrong screen. It's a matter of keeping track of all this, right? I mean, that's the challenge. There's so many moving parts, as you've kind of pointed out, between DC monitoring and managing AD.
Yeah, so the way I see it, there's a couple of types of AD admins. There's the ones that have grown numb. They don't know, they don't care. There's the type of admin that gets like 2,000 or 3,000 alerts and notifications on Active Directory in their mailbox daily, and they don't know what's important. And there's the admin that is just firefighting all day to just try and keep their Active Directory up and running. And I think that the ENow Active Directory monitoring and reporting product has something for all of these admins. You don't want to be buried with thousands of notifications per day. You only want to know when something's truly wrong. And that requires filtering, and that requires the right filters. And even System Center Operations Manager doesn't have the right filters to only give you important messages. And with ENow Active Directory monitoring and reporting, you can have that Active Directory monitoring and that Active Directory reporting. But you also get true domain controller monitoring so that you actually know what's going on your domain controller.
Yeah, I think, the idea behind the product is, as an administrator or when I was responsible for IT, I wanted peace of mind. And I think the tools design, the monitoring side is designed to give you the peace of mind. It must be like a babysitter, checking. Oh, someone shut something off on the network. This DC is not replicating. The reporting side is more housekeeping, because over time people come and leave your organization. Did you remember to remove them out of the domain admins group? Who's the owner? And things can get cluttered. We're seeing that even with the cloud technologies, with governance, with Teams and SharePoint, like things are just being created. So really it's designed to make your job easier. And one of the key things as part of who we are at ENow is we love customer feedback. So that's where I spend my time. Sander's why I think we have a great friendship, because I'm always coming to him with complex problems. Like, hey, we didn't cache this DC. It wasn't authenticating. How do we solve that? And so we release about every 8 weeks. So we're always interested in feedback. Hopefully you got some good information. Sander's written 2 books on this topic of just Active Directory. We have a blog on our site. He has an amazing blog on his site. We are out of time today, so I want to turn it over to Bryce, but hopefully you got some value. Please give us feedback. Sander and I love getting on webinars. If you have other topics that you want us to cover, please let us know.